Welcome to another deep dive, and today we're going behind the scenes, you could say, at the Department of the Interior.
The DOI.
The DOI, yeah, we're going to call it DOI today for short.
Much easier.
Now, you might be thinking about, national parks,
Right.
but it's so much more than that. And we're taking a look at a fascinating document that's basically like a blueprint for how one group thinks the DOI should be run.
It's really interesting, this document. It lays out a vision for the DOI in 2025, and it's packed with history and policy recommendations and even some controversy, too. It really gets to the heart of some of the big debates that we're having as a country.
Okay, let's unpack this thing. So first things first, for anyone out there whose knowledge of the DOI begins and ends with Yellowstone, buckle up.
Yeah, you're telling me the DOI manages a staggering 500 million acres of federal land.
Wow.
We're talking about energy resources like oil, gas, and even coal. Then you've got water management out west. And then the DOI also has trust responsibilities to Native American tribes. It's huge.
100 million acres, that's like, what, a fifth of the entire country?
It's massive.
So this document, it's not just about tweaking things around the edges, is it?
Not at all. It's calling for a pretty radical shift in direction for the DOI. And it starts by painting this picture of the department as kind of a political battleground, with Democrats and Republicans constantly clashing over its priorities.
And in fact, the document claims that every Democratic administration, starting with Carter, has waged a war on the West. What do they mean by that?
Well, it argues that Democrats have consistently favored environmental protection over the needs of Western states, often at the expense of, economic development and resource extraction. And it suggests that this war has been waged through executive actions and regulations, sometimes even bypassing Congress.
That's a pretty loaded term, war on the West. It makes it sound like an intentional attack on a particular region and its way of life.
Exactly. And it reflects, I think, a deep-seated distrust of federal power that's very prevalent in many parts of the West, where people feel that Washington bureaucrats are just out of touch with their needs and their values.
So where does the Trump administration fit into all of this?
Well, the document portrays the Trump administration as a champion of the West, claiming that it reversed the trend of the previous decades and instead prioritized what they called energy dominance.
Energy dominance. What exactly does that mean?
Well, it basically means maximizing American energy production, particularly fossil fuels, with the goal of achieving energy independence and boosting the economy. Under Trump, the DOI opened up millions of acres of federal land to oil and gas drilling. They revived coal mining, and they even pushed for development in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or ANWR.
ANWR. That's a pristine wilderness area in Alaska that's been the subject of so much debate, right?
That's the one. It's home to a diverse array of wildlife, including caribou, polar bears, migratory birds, and it's considered sacred by many indigenous communities. Opening it up to drilling has been a long-standing goal of the oil industry and many Alaska politicians, but it's fiercely opposed by environmental groups and many Native Alaskans.
So this document is clearly advocating for a return to the Trump-era approach to energy policy.
Absolutely. It criticizes the Biden administration for reversing many of those Trump-era policies, arguing that it's hurting average Americans by driving up energy prices and undermining American energy security.
And they claim that Biden's policies are having a disproportionate impact on Alaska?
Yes, Alaska is a recurring theme throughout this document. It claims that the federal government has repeatedly broken promises to Alaska and Native Alaskans, particularly when it comes to land ownership and resource development.
They specifically mentioned that President Carter withdrew millions of acres from state and Native Alaskan use back in the 70s, and that's led to lawsuits that are still ongoing today.
Right. And they argue that this history of broken promises has fueled this deep sense of resentment and distrust towards the federal government in Alaska. They see ANWR as a prime example of this, claiming that Alaskans have been unfairly denied the right to develop their own resources and that the federal government is prioritizing environmental concerns over the economic well-being of Alaskans.
But isn't that the DOI's job to balance those competing interests and make sure we're managing our natural resources responsibly?
That's the heart of the debate, isn't it? What does responsible management look like? This document argues that the pendulum has swung too far in the direction of environmental protection and that we need to kind of rebalance the scales in favor of economic growth and energy independence.
So more drilling, more mining, less regulation.
That's the gist of it. But it's not just about energy. This document lays out a whole laundry list of changes they want to see at the DOI, covering everything from law enforcement on federal lands to the management of wild horses and burros.
Hold on, wild horses. What do wild horses have to do with the DOI?
Well, remember, the DOI manages millions of acres of public lands, and wild horses and burros roam freely on many of those lands, especially out west.
Right, and I've heard there's a bit of an overpopulation problem. Too many horses, not enough food or water.
Exactly. The document claims that wild horse and burro populations have exploded in recent decades, thanks in part to a 1971 law that made it illegal to kill them. As a result, they say that these herds are now overgrazing vast stretches of federal land, damaging ecosystems and crowding out other wildlife.
So what's the solution? Round them all up and put them in zoos.
Well, that's been tried, and it's incredibly expensive. The Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, which is part of the DOI, currently spends millions of dollars every year caring for thousands of horses that have been removed from the range.
And there's not exactly a huge demand for wild Mustangs as pets.
No, not really. The document proposes kind of a multi-pronged approach, including expanding adoptions and sales of captured horses and doing more research into fertility control methods to slow down population growth.
But ultimately, they argue that the most humane and sustainable solution is to allow for some form of culling.
Right? It's a tough topic, but one that they believe needs to be addressed head-on. They argue that the current situation where these animals are essentially left to starve or die of disease is far more cruel than a managed culling program.
Wow, okay, so we've got energy policy, wild horses. What else?
Well, this document also takes aim at the Endangered Species Act, claiming it's being misused to stifle development and that it's time to rethink how we approach species protection.
They actually use the term weaponized, claiming that the Endangered Species Act is often used to protect species that aren't truly endangered at the expense of economic growth and local communities.
And they even propose delisting certain species that they claim have recovered, like the grizzly bear in Yellowstone and the gray wolf in the lower 48 states.
That's sure to be controversial. A lot of people would argue that those species are still vulnerable and need continued protection.
It's a complex issue, and the document clearly reflects a particular perspective, one that prioritizes economic development and individual liberty over federal regulation and environmental protection.
So basically, less government intervention, more freedom for landowners and businesses to do what they want with their property.
That's a key theme running through this document. But it's not just about deregulation. They also call for some pretty significant changes to the way the DOI operates internally, particularly when it comes to law enforcement.
Okay, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of bureaucracy. What kind of changes are they talking about?
Well, they claim there's a lack of accountability within the Bureau of Land Management's law enforcement division. Currently, BLM law enforcement officers often report to supervisors who don't have law enforcement experience, like range managers or park superintendents.
So you could have someone overseeing law enforcement who's actually more focused on, say, managing grazing permits or protecting a particular species.
Exactly. The document argues that this leads to conflicts of interest and inconsistent application of the law, and it undermines the morale and professionalism of the law enforcement officers.
So they want to create a separate chain of command where law enforcement officers report directly to other law enforcement professionals.
That's right. They believe this would lead to a more accountable, professional, and effective law enforcement system on federal lands. They also call for better training and equipment for BLM law enforcement officers, arguing that they need to be as well prepared as any other law enforcement agency in the country.
It sounds like they want to beef up the DOI's law enforcement capabilities significantly.
And they justify it by pointing to the increasing challenges facing BLM law enforcement officers, from drug trafficking and illegal immigration to environmental crimes and conflicts over land use. They argue that the DOI needs to be able to enforce the law effectively and protect its employees and the public.
And all of this is definitely giving me a new perspective on the DOI. I had no idea it was such a complex and controversial agency.
It's a fascinating microcosm of many of the big debates happening in American society right now. The role of government, the balance between conservation and development, the rights of states versus the federal government, the relationship between the U.S. and Native American tribes, it's all there.
Speaking of Native American tribes, that's another area where this document calls for some major changes.
Yes, and it gets pretty critical of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or BIA, claiming that it's failing to live up to its trust responsibilities to tribes.
It accuses the BIA of being too bureaucratic, too top-down, and too focused on federal control at the expense of tribal sovereignty.
And they argue that this paternalistic approach has hindered the ability of tribes to manage their own affairs and develop their economies.
So what do they propose? Abolish the BIA altogether?
That's a radical step that some people advocate for, but this document takes a more incremental approach. They call for reforms that would give tribes more control over their own lands and resources, including the right to develop those resources as they see fit.
So less federal oversight, more tribal self-determination.
Exactly. They believe that tribes are best positioned to make decisions about their own futures and that the BIA should play more of a supporting role, providing technical assistance and resources, but not dictating how those resources are used.
It's a pretty big shift in thinking. But it aligns with this document's overall philosophy of limited government and individual liberty.
Absolutely. They believe that the federal government has become too intrusive in the lives of individuals, businesses, and even sovereign tribal nations, and that it's time to roll back that power and return more control to the people.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. This document lays out a pretty bold and controversial vision for the future of the DOI, touching on everything from energy policy to law enforcement to tribal sovereignty. It's clear that they want to see a much smaller, less powerful DOI with less regulatory authority and more deference to states and tribes.
It's a vision that's sure to spark a lot of debate, especially in our current political climate.
It's fascinating stuff. We'll be back in part 2 to delve even deeper into this vision for the DOI in 2025, so stay tuned. Picking up where we left off, I'm really intrigued by this whole idea of reforming the Bureau of Indian Affairs. What specifically do they propose to give tribes more control over their lands and resources?
Well, one key area they focus on is energy development. Right now, the BIA has significant authority over things like, oil and gas drilling, mining, renewable energy projects on tribal lands.
Which makes sense, I guess, since those lands are held in trust by the federal government.
Right, but this document argues that the BIA's oversight has often been too restrictive, hindering the ability of tribes to, develop their resources and generate revenue. They want to see a system where tribes have the primary authority to decide how those resources are developed, with the BIA playing more of a supporting role.
So more like a consultant than a regulator.
Exactly. They envision a relationship where the BIA provides technical assistance and helps tribes kind of navigate the complex regulatory landscape. But ultimately, the tribes themselves would make the decisions about whether and how to develop their energy resources.
That's a pretty big shift in power dynamics.
It is. And it reflects, I think, a growing movement within Indian country to assert greater self-determination and, control over their own destinies.
But wouldn't that raise concerns about environmental protection? What's to stop a tribe from, say, allowing a polluting industry onto their land if they're desperate for jobs and revenue?
That's a valid concern. But the document argues that tribes have a vested interest in protecting their lands and resources for future generations.
It's their home, after all.
Exactly. And they often have, their own traditional ecological knowledge and practices that they bring to the table.
So they're not just going to throw environmental caution to the wind.
No, but they want the flexibility to set their own environmental standards rather than having to comply with a one-size-fits-all approach dictated by the federal government. The document suggests that the BIA could set some baseline environmental standards that tribes would have to meet, but beyond that, tribes should have the autonomy to tailor their regulations to their specific needs and circumstances.
It sounds like a balancing act, trying to respect tribal sovereignty while also ensuring that environmental protection isn't sacrificed in the name of economic development.
It is, and it's a debate that's playing out in real time across Indian country. Some tribes are eager to embrace energy development as a way to lift their communities out of poverty, while others are more cautious, concerned about the potential impacts on their lands and cultures.
It's a reminder that there's no single Native American perspective on these issues. Each tribe has its own unique history, culture, and set of priorities.
Absolutely. And that's why this document emphasizes the need for a more individualized approach to working with tribes, recognizing their diversity and respecting their right to self-determination.
Okay, so beyond energy development, what other changes do they propose for the BIA?
Well, education is another big focus. They argue that the BIA-run school system is failing Native American students, and they want to see more funding for tribal colleges and more control for tribes over the curriculum in BIA schools.
So less of a one-size-fits-all approach, more of a focus on culturally relevant education that reflects the specific needs and values of each tribe.
Right. They also want to see the BIA do more to address the chronic shortage of healthcare professionals in Indian country, which has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And they call for reforms to the BIA's law enforcement division, which has been plagued by allegations of corruption and misconduct.
It sounds like they want to completely overhaul the BIA from top to bottom to make it more efficient, more accountable, and more responsive to the needs of tribes.
That's the overarching goal. They believe that the BIA has become too bureaucratic and paternalistic, and that it's time to empower tribes to take control of their own destinies.
It's a bold vision, and it certainly aligns with this document's broader theme of shrinking the federal government and returning more power to states and tribes.
It does, and it's a vision that's shared by many people both within and outside of Indian country who believe that the current system is failing Native Americans.
Well, it's certainly given me a lot to think about. But let's move on to another kind of hot button issue that this document tackles, the Endangered Species Act. We touched on it briefly in the last segment, but they really go into detail about their criticisms of the act and how they think it should be reformed.
Yeah, they argue that the Endangered Species Act has become too bureaucratic and too focused on protecting individual species at the expense of the bigger picture.
You mean the needs of local communities and the economy?
Right. They argue that the act is often used to block development projects that could create jobs and boost the economy, even when the scientific evidence for the species' endangerment is weak.
They use a pretty strong language to describe this, calling it weaponized, and claiming that it's often driven by special interest groups who are more interested in expanding their power than in actually protecting species.
Yes, and they even propose delisting certain species that they claim have recovered, like the grizzly bear in Yellowstone and the gray wolf in the lower 48 states.
But those are iconic species. Surely they're still vulnerable.
That's what many environmental groups would argue. But this document contends that the Endangered Species Act has been so successful in protecting these species that they've actually made remarkable recoveries and no longer need the same level of protection.
So they're saying it's time to declare victory and move on?
Essentially, they argue that by continuing to classify these species as endangered, we're diverting resources away from other species that are truly on the brink of extinction. They advocate for a more targeted approach, focusing on species that are in the most dire need of protection.
It's like a triage system deciding which patients get the most attention.
Exactly. And they argue that the current system is too rigid and doesn't allow for enough flexibility in responding to the changing needs of different species.
So what specific changes do they propose to the Endangered Species Act?
Well, one of their key proposals is to give states a greater role in managing endangered species. Right now, the federal government has primary authority over endangered species, but this document argues that states are often better equipped to make decisions about how to protect species within their borders.
But wouldn't that lead to a patchwork of different regulations across the country, with some states doing a good job of protecting species and others not doing so well?
That's a concern, for sure. But the document argues that states have a strong incentive to protect their own natural resources and that they're often more responsive to the needs of local communities.
They also argue that the Endangered Species Act should be more focused on recovery efforts rather than just preventing harm to species, right?
Yes, they believe that the act should be more proactive in helping species recover to the point where they no longer need federal protection.
And they want to see more emphasis on using science to make decisions about species protection rather than relying on emotions or political pressure.
Absolutely. They argue that the Endangered Species Act should be based on sound science and objective data, and that decisions about listing and delisting species should be made transparently with clear evidence to support them.
Well, it sounds like they want to completely revamp the Endangered Species Act from top to bottom. Pretty radical approach.
It is, and it's sure to be met with fierce resistance from environmental groups who see the Endangered Species Act as a crucial tool for protecting biodiversity.
It's another example of how this document really challenges the status quo and proposes some bold and controversial changes to the way the DOI operates.
Exactly. Whether you agree with their proposals or not, it's a document that forces us to grapple with some fundamental questions about the balance between conservation and development, the role of the federal government, and the best way to protect our nation's natural heritage.
And speaking of challenging the status quo, we haven't even touched on their proposals for reforming the National Park Service.
Yes, they have some interesting ideas about how to make our national parks more accessible and affordable for all Americans, while also addressing issues like overcrowding and aging infrastructure.
Well, we'll have to save that for our next segment because we're just about out of time for part 2. But stay tuned for part 3, where we'll delve deeper into the national parks and explore some of the other surprising proposals in this document. Okay, so we talked about reshaping energy policy, overhauling the BIA, even rethinking the Endangered Species Act. But now I'm curious about what this document has to say about our beloved National Park Service. Is nothing sacred?
Well, they don't quite call for bulldozing Yosemite to make way for condos, but they definitely have some provocative ideas about how to modernize and, in their words, right size the Park Service for the 21st century.
Right size, that sounds ominous. What exactly do they mean by that?
Well, they argue that the Park Service has become too bloated and bureaucratic with too much focus on preservation and not enough on recreation and, access for the public. They claim that the parks are being overrun by visitors, which leads to overcrowding, traffic jams, and damage to sensitive ecosystems.
And I've definitely experienced that firsthand. Trying to find parking at Yosemite Valley in the summer can be a nightmare.
Exactly. And they argue that the Park Service is struggling to keep up with the growing demand, with outdated infrastructure and a chronic shortage of funding.
So what's their solution?
Limit?
The number of visitors, raise entrance fees, privatize the parks.
They don't go quite that far, but they do propose some pretty significant changes. For one, they advocate for streamlining the process for approving new concessions and amenities within the parks.
So more hotels, restaurants, maybe even things like zip lines and adventure tours.
That's the idea. They argue that by offering more amenities and activities, the Park Service could attract a wider range of visitors, including, younger people and families who are looking for more than just hiking and camping.
But wouldn't that kind of take away from the natural beauty and solitude that people seek in national parks?
That's a concern that many people have. But the document argues that it's possible to strike a balance between, development and preservation.
They also suggest that the Park Service should be more proactive in promoting and marketing the parks to a wider audience, right?
Yes, they believe that the parks are a national treasure that should be accessible to all Americans regardless of their income or background. They propose things like offering discounts for low-income families, partnering with schools and community groups, and even creating a national park loyalty program.
Interesting. So it's not just about cutting costs and shrinking the Park Service. They actually want to see it expand its reach and connect with new audiences.
Right. They see the parks as playing a vital role in promoting education, health and wellness, and even economic development.
Okay, but what about the issue of overcrowding? How do they propose to address that?
Well, they suggest exploring things like timed entry systems, shuttle services, and even limiting the number of vehicles allowed into certain parks.
So more emphasis on public transportation and alternative modes of transportation within the park.
Exactly. They also talk about the need to invest in upgrading park infrastructure, including roads, trails, campgrounds, and visitor centers.
Which will take a lot of money, which the Park Service chronically lacks.
Right, and they acknowledge that addressing these challenges will require a significant investment from the federal government.
But their overall goal seems to be to make the parks more sustainable, both financially and environmentally.
Yes. They want to see a park system that's financially self-sufficient while also preserving the natural resources and cultural heritage that make the park so special.
It's a vision that's sure to spark a lot of debate among park enthusiasts and conservationists. Some people will welcome the idea of making the parks more accessible and appealing to a wider range of visitors, while others will worry about the potential impacts on the park's natural beauty and solitude.
It's a balancing act for sure, and there are no easy answers. But it's a conversation that we need to have as a nation if we want to ensure that our national parks remain vibrant and relevant for generations to come.
Well, this deep dive has certainly opened my eyes to the complexities of managing our public lands and resources. It's a web of competing interests and values, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be informed and engaged in these debates. The decisions we make today about how to manage our public lands will have a profound impact on the future of our country.
So what can our listeners do to make their voices heard on these issues?
Well, first and foremost, stay informed. Read about the issues, listen to different perspectives, and form your own opinions. Then reach out to your elected officials and let them know where you stand. Support organizations that are working to protect our public lands, and most importantly, get out there and experience these places for yourself.
Because once you've stood on the rim of the Grand Canyon or hiked through a redwood forest, it's hard not to be moved by the power and beauty of these places and to feel a sense of responsibility for protecting them.
Exactly. Our public lands are a national treasure, and it's up to all of us to ensure that they're preserved for future generations.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. I've learned a lot, and I hope our listeners have too.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep engaging in the debate about the future of our public lands.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of ideas and information.